He woke up in the most expensive room in the hospital and did not know his own name. The ceiling was white, not the white of something freshly painted, but the white of something that had been cleaned so many times it had become a kind of absence. He looked at it the way a newborn looks at light, not understanding it, but knowing in some wordless way that it was important. A monitor beeped to his left. He counted the beeps without knowing he was counting. 7, 8, 9. The rhythm of a thing that did not need him to participate. A nurse came in, young, efficient, with the particular calm of someone who had stood in this room, or rooms exactly like it enough times that the equipment had stopped seeming like equipment and started seeming like furniture. She had a clipboard and the practiced expression of a person delivering news that was not new to her, but would be new to everyone who received it. She asked him his name. He opened his mouth. He waited. Nothing arrived, not a word, not a shape, not even the ghost of a sound that might have once been his name. Just the ceiling and the beeping and the nurse looking at him with an expression that was careful and patient and had clearly been practiced over many years in many rooms exactly like this one. She asked again. He looked at her. He looked at his hands on the white sheet, large hands, hands that carried something, a roughness in the knuckles, a thickness in the palms that did not match the clean room or the expensive bed. The hands of a man who had once done something with them. He could not remember what. He turned them over slowly, studying them, the way you study something you found on the floor of a house you have just moved into. Knowing it belonged to someone, but not yet knowing who. He looked back at the ceiling. The nurse wrote something in the chart and left. Terrell Ashford was 64 years old. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall. He had been born in Monroe, Georgia, in a house his father had rented for $80 a month, and he had left Monroe at 19 with $340 in his left pocket, each bill folded into a small, neat rectangle. Because when you have very little, you learn to know exactly where every dollar is. The habit of counting, of knowing, of keeping exact account of what remains does not leave a person when the need for it is gone. It simply moves underground into the hands, into the body, into the way a man reaches for his wallet in a dark restaurant without looking. He did not remember any of this. He had started his working life fixing other people's houses for cash. He had a gift for it that went beyond skill, a gift for seeing what a structure needed, the way some people can see what a sentence needs. The load-bearing wall, the joist that was carrying weight it was never meant to carry. The small failing that was making everything around it work harder than necessary. He could walk into a building that had stood for 30 years and within an hour identify the 3 decisions made in its construction that would eventually kill it. Landlords paid him to find what they did not want to find because finding it early was cheaper than finding it after the ceiling fell. By the time he was 24, he had borrowed $3,800 from a man at his church who believed in him more than the evidence warranted, and he had used it to buy a condemned duplex on the south side of Monroe. He had gutted it himself. The floor in the kitchen had been so rotten, he fell through it on the second day standing in the hole up to his waist covered in insulation and sawdust. And he had laughed because there was nothing else to do, and because the laughing felt like the only honest response to a situation that could either end him or teach him, and he had decided very early in his life that he would only allow one of those outcomes. He rented both units. He used the rent money to buy the next one, and the one after that, and the one after that, each building teaching him something the last one had not. There was a grammar to real estate that no school taught, and no book fully explained the grammar of patience and leverage in the precise moment when a neighborhood was about to become something different from what it currently was. He learned that grammar the way you learn a language, by living in a country rather than studying it in a classroom, through immersion, through error, through the slow accumulation of instinct. 45 years later, Ashford Development Group operated 14 commercial towers across the American South, 3 mixed-use complexes under construction, and a corporate headquarters in Midtown Atlanta, with his name on the building in letters large enough to read from the interstate. The man who had stood in a hole in a rotten kitchen floor in Monroe, Georgia, laughing, was worth $6.2 billion. He still folded his money into small rectangles. He had never stopped. He placed each bill facing the same direction, with the precision of a man who remembered what it felt like to have only one, and what it felt like to reach into his pocket in the dark and know by touch exactly what was there. His assistants noticed it. His lawyers noticed it. The people who sat across boardroom tables from him and prepared to negotiate against a man who had built an empire Notice that when the meeting was over and everyone shook hands and gathered papers, Terrell Ashford reached into his wallet and his fingers moved with the automatic care of a man who had once counted pennies seriously. None of this existed for him now. The room was clean. The light came through the window. The monitor kept its rhythm. He was a man with large hands and a white ceiling and no name. His name was the first thing to go. His children were close behind. He had two of them. Jalen, 38, lived in Brookhaven, 25 minutes from the hospital by the route that avoided the interstate. Destiny, 34, had been in Miami when the call came. Both of them worked for Ashford Development Group in positions that had been created for them rather than earned by them. Terrell had known this. He had not said it. He had believed that time would do what conversation could not, that eventually they would grow into the roles the way he had grown into buildings by standing inside them long enough, by learning their weight. He had been wrong about this, but he had not known it yet. And the not knowing had become its own kind of patience, the kind that looks like wisdom from the outside and feels from the inside, like a man standing in a hallway waiting for a door to open that has been locked from the other side for years. The accident had happened on a Tuesday night. Terrell had been driving south on I-85, heading from the office toward the house in Buckhead that had been too large for one person for the 8 years since the divorce, and had been too large for one person before the divorce too, if he was being honest, which the hospital, in the amnesia, in the white ceiling, were making him consider in a new way. He had been in the left lane. The SUV crossed the median at approximately 60 miles per hour, coming over the grass divider from the northbound lanes. The driver had suffered a cardiac event behind the wheel. He was already dead before the vehicles made contact. The impact was head-on. Fire and rescue arrived in 7 minutes. It took them 22 more to cut the driver's side door open and remove him from the vehicle. The smell inside the car, according to the first responder report that no one would read to Terrell, was rubber and heat and the chemical odor of a deployed airbag which smells like nothing else, and which everyone who has experienced it carries with them forever afterward. He was transported to Grady Memorial Hospital. The emergency team recorded the following on admission: traumatic brain injury, 3 fractured ribs, internal bruising lacerations to the face and forearms. Glasgow Coma Scale score of 6 upon arrival. Surgery lasted 6 hours. He survived. 4 days later, he opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling. A nurse asked him his name. Nothing arrived. Another nurse. Still nothing. The attending physician. A specialist. They spoke to him in careful, measured voices, the voices of people trained to deliver reality in doses small enough to be absorbed without doing further damage. He answered the questions he could answer. He looked at the window. He looked at his hands. He looked at the ceiling and waited for something to come back that showed no sign of coming. Jalen arrived at Grady Memorial 3 hours after his father was admitted. He had been at a fundraiser when the call came, and he had finished his conversation before leaving, which told you something about Jalen Ashford that nothing else needed to add. He went directly to the attending physician. Dr. Celeste Vaughn, a neurologist with 23 years of practice, had seen enough families in crisis to read a room before anyone spoke. She noted the word Jalen used when he asked about his father's condition. Not hurt, not is he okay, incapacitated. She answered his medical questions carefully. She did not answer the one he had not yet asked, which had to do with legal authority over decisions that were not medical. Destiny arrived 5 hours after admission. She had not come alone. Beside her was a man in a gray suit carrying a leather folder. Reginald Crenshaw, her personal attorney. His suit had the creases of a man who had not changed clothes for a transatlantic flight, though the distance had only been Miami. Destiny went to the nurse's station and asked about financial access and emergency signatory power before she asked what floor her father was on. They stood at his bedside together. Both of them. The monitors kept their rhythm. Jalen said, "Dad." Terrell looked at him. There was no recognition. Not hostility, not confusion. Just the absence of connection, the way you look at a stranger in an elevator, polite and distant, and waiting for the door to open. Destiny said her name. Terrell blinked. He looked at her face with the attention of someone trying to solve a problem they did not have the tools for. Nothing arrived. He looked back at the ceiling. They stayed for 20 minutes. When they walked to the elevator, Jalen said, "If he does not recover cognitive function, we need to move on the trust restructuring before the board does." Destiny pressed the call button. The elevator opened. She stepped inside. I already have, she said. The doors closed. In the room behind them, their father sat in the bed with his hands resting on the white sheet, his fingers slowly folding the edge of the fabric into a small, neat rectangle. He did not know why he was doing it. He just knew his hands wanted to. Dr. Vaughn sat them both down in the consultation room the following morning and explained it plainly. She had done this before. She did not soften it, and she did not dramatize it. She laid out what was true. The condition was called retrograde amnesia. It was caused by the traumatic brain injury sustained in the crash. What it meant in practical terms was this: Terrell could speak, he could reason, he could follow a conversation, form new thoughts, tell you what he wanted for lunch, or whether the window should be open or closed. His present mind was intact. What was gone was everything behind him: his long-term memory, his history, the name of his company, the faces of his children. The 40 years of work that had built everything the two people sitting in front of her were now trying to protect. She told them that approximately 1.5 million Americans suffer traumatic brain injuries each year. Of those, roughly 10 to 20% experience some form of lasting memory loss. Terrell was in that percentage. His procedural memory, the kind that lives in the body rather than the mind, appeared undamaged. He could dress himself, he could tie his shoes, he could fold things into neat rectangles without knowing why his hands wanted to do it. Jalen asked how long recovery would take. Dr. Vaughn said, "There is no timeline. Memory recovery after traumatic brain injury is not linear. It does not follow a schedule. It follows stimulation, familiar voices, familiar routines, familiar smells and sounds and stories from the patient's life. The brain needs anchors. It needs repeated, consistent exposure to people who knew the patient before the injury. That is the single most effective factor in recovery we have documented." She looked at both of them directly. "It depends on who shows up." Jalen looked at Destiny. Destiny looked at her phone. Reginald Crenshaw did not look at anyone. The first 3 days they came, both of them. 30 minutes each visit, sometimes 45. They sat in the chairs beside Terrell's bed and spoke to each other about the things that concerned them: the trust structure, the board's interim decisions, the quarterly filings that needed a signature they could not currently obtain. They spoke about these things in Terrell's presence, near Terrell's body, in Terrell's room. But they did not speak to Terrell. Terrell sat in the bed and watched them. He did not understand the words they used. He did not understand the papers they brought. He understood something else, something that did not require memory to recognize, some older system of reading a room that had survived the accident intact, the same system that had let him walk into a building and know within an hour where the failing was. He was using it now in a hospital room on two people who thought they were visiting a patient and did not understand they were being read. On the second day after Jalen and Destiny had left, he asked the nurse a question. He said, "Are those people my children?" Cheryl, the nurse assigned to his floor that week, said yes. Terrell was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They do not seem comfortable here." Cheryl did not write this in the chart. She thought about it for the rest of her shift. By day 4, Jalen came every other day. His visits shortened to 15 minutes, then 12. He would stand at the foot of the bed, speak to Dr. Vaughn in the hallway, and leave. Destiny stopped coming altogether. She called the nurses' station instead. The calls were brief. She asked about legal competency assessments. She asked about guardianship timelines. She rarely asked how he was feeling. When she did not wait for the full answer before asking her next question. On day 8, Jalen came for the last time. He brought a document. He placed it on the bedside table and explained to Terrell, slowly, as though speaking to someone who did not understand English, rather than someone who did not understand his own past, that this was a standard document, that it was for Terrell's protection, that it simply allowed Jalen to make decisions on his behalf while he recovered. Terrell looked at the document. He could not read it, not because the words were too complex, but because the words required a context he no longer had. He did not know what Ashford Development Group was. He did not know what a trust was. He did not know why the man standing beside his bed was in such a hurry, but he could read the man. And what he read was a person trying to reach the end of something as quickly as the paperwork would allow. Terrell did not sign. He said, "I would like to wait." Jalen took the document and left. He did not come back. Days 9 through 17. No one came. The room was large and quiet. The light came in each morning around 7:15, moved across the floor in a slow diagonal, and reached the far wall by noon. Terrell watched it every day without knowing he was watching it. He simply sat in the chair by the window each morning because the chair was there and the light was there, and sitting in it felt like the thing to do. The movement of light across a floor is the slowest clock in the world, and it is the most honest one. It does not speed up or slow down. It does not care who is in the room. It arrives each morning and moves through its arc and does its work regardless. He watched it for 9 days. On day 14, Cheryl wrote the following in his chart, patient calm. No visitors in 9 days. Patient asked today, does anyone know I am here? She put down her pen. She looked at the note. She added nothing else. She went back to the nurse's station and thought about a man with hands like that. Hands that had clearly built or fixed or shaped things for most of their life, lying in a room alone for 9 days asking whether anyone knew he was there. On the other side of Atlanta, in the break room of a Marriott on the north side of the city, a woman named Camilla Sable was eating lunch. She was 61 years old. She had been born in Albany, Georgia, the kind of small southern town that people describe by what it does not have rather than what it does. She had no college degree. She had started cleaning houses at 22, and by the time she was 30, she had become the kind of housekeeper who knew what a house needed before the house knew it itself. The creak that meant a hinge was going. The silence that meant a filter needed changing. The particular quality of dust that said a room had not been entered in too long. These were not skills she had been taught. They were a form of attention, a way of being present in a space that most people move through without really inhabiting. Her husband Jerome had died 12 years before. Lung cancer. 14 months from the diagnosis to the end. She had been with him for every one of those months, sleeping in a chair beside his hospital bed until the nurses stopped asking her to go home and simply brought her a blanket each night. She had held his hand through the treatments and through the hours when the treatments had done everything they could do and there was nothing left but presence. She had learned in those 14 months that presence was not nothing, that sometimes it was the only medicine that remained. She had one son, Marcus, 29, living in Houston. He called every Sunday. He always said, "Mama, come live with me." She always said, "I have things here." She never specified what the things were. Marcus had stopped asking, but he had not stopped calling, and the calling was its own kind of answer. She had worked for the Ashford household for 9 years. She had not been fired by Terrell. She had been fired by Nyan, his wife, who in the weeks following the divorce filing had dismissed every member of the household staff in what appeared to be an act of erasure rather than economy, the way some people, when they are ending one chapter of their lives, find it necessary to remove every object and every person that belongs to the chapter they are leaving. Camilla had received the call on a Thursday. She had thanked Nyan for the years. She had packed her cleaning supplies into a plastic bin, placed it in the trunk of her car, and driven home. She had not resented the firing. She had simply moved on, the way she moved through everything with her whole attention on the next thing that needed doing. She kept a small, leather-bound notebook in her purse. She had carried one like it for decades. Inside, she wrote the things that mattered about every household she served. Birthdays, allergies, preferences, habits, the small facts of a life that most people do not think anyone notices. The section on Terrell Ashford was 11 pages long. She had not opened it in 6 years, but she had not removed it either. It was a document of a life she had been close to without ever owning any part of it. Burnell Hayes worked the same floor at the Marriott, 55 years old, practical, forthright, in the way of a woman who had long ago decided that the most efficient form of kindness was honesty. She sat across from Camilla at the break room table on the 17th day, watching her friends stare at a phone screen without eating. "What is it?" Burnell said. Camilla turned the phone around. The article was 3 paragraphs in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's digital edition. Ashford Development CEO in critical condition after I-85 crash. 17 days ago. Already buried on page 6, already old news in the city's daily accounting of misfortune. A small item. 3 paragraphs. His name, the date, the hospital. Nothing else. Burnell read it. She looked at Camilla. "You knew him." "I worked for him. 9 years. "And you're thinking about going." Camilla said nothing. She put the phone down. Burnell leaned forward. "Camilla, think about what you're doing. He does not remember you. He does not remember anyone. You were let go 6 years ago. You don't owe him anything. You show up there and his family, his lawyers, They will look at you like you are trying to get something, and they will have a story about you before you open your mouth. Camilla folded her hands on the table. The break room around them was the generic institutional beige of rooms that are designed to be used but not occupied, the kind of room that does not invite lingering. You are 61 years old, Burnell said. You are making $16.50 an hour cleaning rooms that strangers sleep in and forget. And you want to go sit with a man who doesn't know your name in a hospital room where his children are probably already fighting over his estate. Tell me what sense that makes. Camilla picked up her sandwich. She took one bite. She set it down. He was kind to me once, she said, in a way that cost him something. I never forgot it. Burnell sat back. She looked at her friend for a long moment. She had known Camilla Sable for 4 years, long enough to recognize the particular stillness that settled over her when a decision had moved from consideration to commitment. It was not the stillness of a person who had stopped thinking. It was the stillness of a person who had finished thinking and was now simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. Then Burnell picked up her own lunch and said nothing more, because she had known Camilla long enough to understand that when Camilla stopped explaining herself, the decision had already been made and words were only getting in the way. That evening, Camilla called Marcus. He answered on the second ring the way he always did on Sunday, except it was Wednesday. She told him about the article. She told him she was thinking of going to the hospital. The silence on the other end had the particular weight of the silence that is being held carefully, the way you hold something fragile when you are deciding whether to put it down gently or set it somewhere safe. Then Marcus said, "Mama, he doesn't remember you." "I know. You were fired. You don't work for them anymore. You haven't for 6 years. "I know that too." "Then what are you doing?" "You go in there and his family's going to ask questions. Who are you? Why are you here? What do you want?" And you won't have a good answer because from where they're standing, there isn't one. "I'll have my answer," Camilla said. "It just won't be one they'll understand." Marcus was quiet again. "What answer is that?" "That he was kind to me once. And when I read that no one had been to see him in more than 2 weeks, I thought about what it must feel like to wake up in a room and not know your own name and not have anyone come." She paused. "I know what that room feels like, Marcus. I sat in a room like that for 14 months. Marcus did not speak for a long time. He sat in his apartment in Houston with the phone pressed to his ear and thought about his mother in a hospital chair. Night after night, a blanket the nurses had started leaving for her because they had stopped asking her to go home. He thought about what it had taken to be that person, to remain that person through 14 months of watching someone diminish, and what it said about someone who would go looking for that same quality of presence in another person's crisis with no obligation, no payment, no reciprocal history of care. Then he said, "Call me when you're back." She set her alarm for 5:30 in the morning. She went into the kitchen and made scrambled eggs with no salt and cut the toast on the diagonal and placed everything in a small container and sealed the lid. She had the thermos ready. She had found the white ceramic mug, heavy and plain, with no pattern at a Goodwill on Peachtree Industrial 3 weeks before for $2.30. She had not known then why she bought it. She knew now. She arrived at Grady Memorial at 7:18 in the morning. The parking lot was already filling with the particular population of a hospital. At that hour, the people arriving for procedures and the people who had never left. She walked through the front entrance carrying the food container in one hand and a folding chair tucked under her left arm, because she had learned a long time ago that hospitals never had enough chairs in the right places, and that bringing your own said something to the people around you about how long you intended to stay. The receptionist on the 4th floor looked at her. Camilla stood with her back straight in a clean coat, not new but well kept, with the folding chair under her arm and the food container in her right hand. "I'm here to visit Terrell Ashford," she said. The receptionist looked at the screen. "Are you family?" "No," Camilla said. "I used to work for him. Only family members are permitted to visit patients in this unit." Camilla stood very still. She said, "Has any family visited him in the last week?" The pause that followed answered the question before the receptionist could form the words. Then the receptionist said, "Let me check with the attending nurse." Dr. Celeste Vaughn came to the reception area 12 minutes later. She looked at Camilla. She looked at the food container. She looked at the folding chair. She said, "You worked for Mr. Ashford 9 years. I was his housekeeper, doctor." Dr. Vaughn said, "How well did you know him?" Camilla said, "I knew how he took his coffee. I knew the sound he made when he thought no one was listening. I knew which room he went to when he was sad. I knew what he ate for breakfast every morning for 9 years. I knew that he folded his money into small rectangles and that he did not like to be spoken to before 5:35 in the morning. I worked for him for 9 years. Dr. Vaughn was quiet for a moment. She looked at the folding chair. She looked at the food container. She thought about the 9 days of no visitors she had documented in her case notes. She thought about a man who had asked a nurse whether anyone knew he was there and had not received an answer that changed anything. Then she said, "That is more than his children have told me in 17 days. She signed Camilla in. She walked her down the corridor. She opened the door. Terrell was sitting in the chair by the window. The morning light had just reached the armrest. He was looking at the parking lot the way he looked at most things now, with the quiet attention of a man who had nothing to compare anything to. He turned when the door opened. He looked at Camilla. His face did not change the way a face changes when it sees someone it knows. But it did not do what it had done when Jalen and Destiny walked in either. It did not go polite and distant and empty. Something else happened. Something smaller. His brow moved slightly. His head tilted just barely the way a person tilts toward a sound they cannot quite place. He looked at her the way a person looks at a song they cannot name, but have heard before, something in him reaching toward an identification that the conscious mind could not yet supply. Camilla did not introduce herself. She did not explain who she was. She did not say, "Do you remember me?" She set the folding chair beside the window. She sat down. She placed the food container on the bedside table. She opened it. "Scrambled eggs, no salt. Toast cut diagonal." Terrell looked at the food. He looked at it for a long time. He did not know why, but something about the way it was arranged, the angle of the toast, the texture of the eggs, the absence of anything extra on the plate, made his hands relax on the armrest in a way they had not relaxed since he woke up in this room. He picked up the fork. He ate slowly in silence. Camilla sat in her chair and looked out the window. She did not watch him eat. She did not ask if it was good. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, and she was quiet the way she had been quiet in his kitchen at 5:15 every morning for 9 years. When the food was gone, she stood. She closed the container. She folded the napkin and placed it inside. She picked up the chair. "I'll come back tomorrow," she said. She walked to the door. She opened it. She stepped through. Behind her, Terrell sat in the chair by the window. The light had moved to his knees. He looked at the empty container on the table. He looked at the door that had just closed. He pressed the call button. Cheryl came. "Everything all right?" she said. "The woman who was just here," Terrell said. "She knew how I eat." It was the first sentence he had spoken in 17 days. Not a question. A statement of fact about a world that had otherwise offered him none. A fragment of order in a landscape of blankness. Someone had known something about him that he did not know about himself, and that was more than anyone had given him since he opened his eyes in this room. Cheryl wrote it in the chart. She underlined it once. That same evening, Camilla's phone rang with a number she did not recognize. She answered. "Miss Sable." The voice was measured, prepared, the voice of a woman who had planned this call before she made it. "This is Destiny Ashford. I understand you visited my father today. I would very much like to speak with you." Camilla stood in her kitchen in the small apartment near the bus line. The stove light was on. The rest of the kitchen was in the particular quiet of late evening, the kind of quiet that happens after a day of work, when the body has stopped moving and the mind has not yet followed. "All right," she said. Part 2, the anchors. The coffee shop Destiny had chosen was 3 blocks from the hospital, the kind of place with exposed brick and locally sourced menus and servers who introduced themselves by name and asked about your dietary restrictions before offering you water. It had been chosen, Camilla understood immediately upon entering, because it was close enough to feel convenient, but formal enough to establish a register. A room that said, "This is a business conversation and not a personal one." A room that belonged to the world of attorneys and board meetings rather than the world of kitchens and hospital corridors. Destiny was already seated when Camilla arrived. She was 34 years old and carried the particular composure of someone who had been taught from childhood that composure was the most important thing to demonstrate in a room where the stakes were high. She stood when Camilla came in. She shook her hand. She waited until Camilla had sat down and ordered water before she placed the manila envelope on the table between them. "I want to be direct," Destiny said. "Think you'll appreciate that." Camilla looked at the envelope. She did not touch it. My father is in a vulnerable state. He does not know who he is, who we are, or who you are. He is being attended to by medical professionals, and he has family who are managing his affairs and ensuring that his interests are protected. Destiny folded her hands on the table in the careful way of someone conducting a meeting. What he does not need is a former employee spending hours every day in his room influencing him in ways that cannot be properly monitored or understood. I brought him breakfast, Camilla said. I understand that. Destiny slid the envelope forward an inch. Inside is a letter. It requests that you voluntarily agree not to visit my father for a period of 90 days, which would allow the medical team to assess his condition without external variables. It also contains a check. She paused, giving the pause the weight of something that was meant to seem generous. $15,000 as compensation for your time. Camille looked at the envelope. She looked at it the way she looked at most things that required a decision, steadily without hurry, giving it the respect of full attention before she responded. $15,000 was approximately 8 months of her salary at the Marriott. She noted the number not with longing, but with the clarity of a woman who had learned to see money clearly, neither more nor less than what it was. Then she pushed it back across the table. I didn't come for money, she said. Destiny's composure held. Everyone comes for something. Camille looked at her. Your father sat in his kitchen at 2 in the morning once and cried because he realized he wasn't sad about losing your mother. He was sad because the absence of sadness told him something about 22 years of his life. She kept her voice even and her eyes direct. I sat across from him and didn't say a word. I was there for 45 minutes. Then I washed his glass and went upstairs. That is what I came back for, not money. The coffee shop was quiet around them. Outside, Atlanta moved through its morning. Destiny said nothing for a moment. Something moved across her face that was not quite the composure she had walked in with. Then she said, you don't have legal standing to be in that room. I know, Camilla said. Neither does kindness. She stood, put on her coat, and left. She did not know as she walked back to her car that Reginald Crenshaw had been seated 2 tables away with a newspaper he had not read. She did not know he had been documenting the meeting from the moment she sat down. Photographs and notes, the careful assembly of a case that had not yet been filed, but was being built with the methodical patience of a man who had been paid to be patient on behalf of people who were not. She found out later. At the time, she drove to the hospital and went upstairs and sat in the chair by the window and told Terrell Ashford about the light above his stove. She said, you turned it on at 5:15 every morning when it was still dark outside. You never turned on the overhead light. You said once that the overhead light made the kitchen feel like a hospital. You wanted it to feel like a kitchen. Terrell was looking at the parking lot. Then he turned his head slightly. He said, I think I know that light. Camille nodded once and let the sentence sit where it was. On the table between them, the white mug held the last of the coffee gone cold. She did not press. She had learned in 9 years of mornings that the most important thing was not to fill the silence before it was ready to be filled. A silence with something growing in it is not a silence that needs to be corrected. On the second day, she brought coffee. Black and no sugar in the white ceramic mug from the Goodwill. She poured it from a thermos in her bag. Terrell closed his fingers around the body of the mug and turned it once slowly. His fingers found the weight of it familiar, the way hands find a doorknob in the dark without needing to see it. The knowledge not in the mind, but in the muscle and the nerve, and the long memory of repeated contact. He drank without speaking. She sat and was quiet. On the 4th day, she began to talk. Not about the company, not about the buildings or the board or anything that required him to have a past. She talked about small things. You used to say thank you in a way most people didn't notice, she said. You didn't say the words often. You said it by remembering. If I mentioned once that my son was applying to a program 3 weeks later, you would ask how it went. That was your thank you. Most people say it with their mouth. You said it with your attention. Terrell listened. His hands were on the armrests. He was looking at the window. You kept every birthday card your children ever made you in a drawer in your study, she said. Bottom left. The drawer was organized by year. You thought nobody knew about it. I dusted that drawer every week for 9 years. I never opened the cards, but I put them back in the same order every time. Terrell turned to look at her. He did not remember these things, not the drawer, not the cards, not the way he said thank you. But something about the way she described them had a weight to it that was different from anything Jalen or Destiny had told him. They had told him about contracts. They had told him about the company structure. They had told him what he owned. Camilla was telling him who he was, and he could feel the difference not as memory, but as something closer to recognition. A shape of a man who woke early because the quiet meant something, a man who said thank you 3 weeks later, a man who kept birthday cards in a drawer organized by year and thought no one knew. He said, "That sounds like someone I would want to be." She looked at him steadily. "It is someone you were." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Tell me more." And she did. On the fifth day, she told him about the mornings, the way he stood at the kitchen window for several minutes before sitting down, looking at the yard with the particular attention of someone performing a daily inventory of what remained. The way he drank his first cup of coffee standing up and his second one sitting down and never the other way around, as if the sitting down was a reward he had not yet earned when the first cup was poured. The way he nodded slightly when something in his reading surprised him, as if the idea had asked permission to enter and he was granting it. These were not large things. They were the small grammar of a daily life, and they were precisely what the brain needed, according to Dr. Vaughn, to begin finding its way back. On the sixth day, Dr. Vaughn stopped Camilla in the hallway before her visit. "He's doing something with paper," Dr. Vaughn said, "folding it into small rectangles, napkins, the edge of his bed sheet. He does it without seeming to know why." "He's done that since I knew him," Camilla said. Dr. Vaughn nodded. "Procedural memory, the body doing what it's always done, even when the conscious mind has no explanation for it. What you're doing here, Miss Sable, is not visiting. It is treatment. The brain needs anchors. You are giving him anchors." She paused. "Keep coming." Camilla went into the room. Terrell was sitting in the chair with a folded $5 bill in his hands. He looked up. He said, "I don't know why I do this." Camilla looked at his hands. She said, "You have always done it, since before I knew you." He set the folded bill on the bedside table. He said, "It feels like counting, like making sure something is still there." She opened the food container and set out his breakfast and said nothing more because the sentence had found its meaning on its own, and adding to it would have been the wrong kind of help. Marcus arrived in Atlanta on a Thursday 9 days into Camilla's visits. He had not told her he was coming. He appeared at the door of the apartment on a Thursday evening with a bag over his shoulder and the expression of a man who has had a 2-hour flight to think about something and has not arrived at peace with it. He was 29 years old and had his mother's eyes and a stubbornness that could be either very useful or very difficult depending on the situation. And over the past 9 days, the situation had been providing him with more opportunity than he had wanted to test which one it was. "You're still going," he said. It was not a question. "Every day," Camilla said. She stepped back from the door. He came in. He sat at the kitchen table. She made tea. He watched her move around the kitchen the way he had watched her move since he was old enough to notice things, with the particular efficiency of someone who does not waste motion and does not waste attention, and has made both of those choices so completely that they are no longer choices, just the way she moves through the world. His mother could make a kitchen feel purposeful by walking into it. It was not something she did. It was something she was. He said, "They have lawyers, Mama." "I know. Not just as kids. There's an attorney, Crenshaw, who's been documenting your visits. I found out this morning. Someone at the hospital mentioned it." Camilla set the mugs on the table. "He's building a file," Marcus said. "Undue influence. That's the legal theory. If he can show that you've been alone with a man who doesn't know his own name for hours every day, and that this man subsequently changes any decision about his estate or his care, they can argue you manipulated him. That even though you had no formal authority, your access gave you practical influence that compromised his decision-making." Camilla sat down. She wrapped her hands around the mug. "He can't argue I influenced decisions that haven't been made. He'll argue the foundation was set before the decisions. That's how these cases work." Marcus leaned forward. "You don't have power of attorney. You don't have any legal standing. If they file a motion to restrict your access, there is nothing stopping a judge from granting it. And if they paint this as an elderly man with brain damage being managed by a former employee who showed up with no family authorization, there are judges in this county who will see it exactly that way. Has he filed one? Not yet." Camilla looked at her son. "Then I'll keep going until he does." Marcus looked at the ceiling. He looked at his mother. He said, "You know what I keep thinking about, Dad? The hospital? You sleeping in that chair every night. The nurses knew you by name after a week. The other patients' families would nod to you in the hallway. And not once in 14 months did anyone ask you what you were getting out of it." Camille was quiet. "Because it was obvious," Marcus said. "Because some things you do because of what they are not, because of what you get from them." He picked up his mug. "I know that. I've always known that. I just needed to say it out loud before I could let myself stop arguing with you." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. They sat like that for a while, not speaking the way people do sit when they have finished arguing about something that was never really about what it appeared to be about. The next morning, Camilla went back to the hospital. Marcus drove her. He waited in the car without being asked to, which meant more than asking would have. On the 8th day of her visits, Camilla brought music. Not a song she thought Terrell would recognize. She did not know what songs he had listened to in private. She knew what she had played on Saturday mornings when she cleaned the house because she had played the same one every Saturday for 9 years. A gospel track, or the kind of song that was not about arrival, but about persistence, not about the destination, but about the willingness to keep going when the destination cannot be seen. She played it from her phone, the speaker resting on the bedside table. Terrell listened, his head turned toward the sound the way a plant turns toward light, not by decision, but by design. His eyes closed. The song played for 2 minutes and 40 seconds. When it finished, he opened his eyes. He said one word: "Saturday." Camilla nodded. She pressed play again. 2 weeks after her first visit, Jalen called the nurse's station. It was a Tuesday. Cheryl answered. Jalen asked about his father's condition. Cheryl gave him the standard update, then mentioned that his regular visitor was currently in the room if he would like to pass along a message. Jalen said, "What regular visitor?" Cheryl said, "Miss Sable. She's been coming every day for 2 weeks." The silence on the line had the particular weight of a silence being rearranged. Then Jalen said thank you and hung up. 40 minutes later, Jalen and Destiny arrived on the 4th floor together, walking at the pace of people who had somewhere specific to be and something specific to prevent. They turned the corner and found Camilla coming out of Terrell's room, carrying the empty food container in one hand and the folding chair under her arm. Destiny spoke first. "What are you doing here?" "Visiting," Camilla said. "You were terminated 6 years ago." "By your mother," Camilla said. "Not by your father. And I'm not here for employment." Jalen stepped forward, lowering his voice to something that was meant to sound reasonable and calm, and free of the urgency that was very much present underneath it. "We appreciate your concern." "We do, but our father is in a fragile state. He doesn't know who you are. He doesn't know who anyone is. Having an unauthorized person spending hours in his room every day is not something we can allow." Dr. Vaughn appeared in the hallway behind them. She had been walking toward Terrell's room for a routine check. She stopped. She listened. She waited for Jalen to finish. Then she said, "Miss Sable is the only consistent presence your father has had in 20 days. Her visits are not unauthorized. They are, from a medical standpoint, the only treatment currently producing measurable results. His verbal output has increased. His affect has shifted. He is engaging with stimuli in ways he was not engaging before she arrived." She looked at both of them. "I approved her visits, and I will continue to approve them." Destiny said, "She has no legal standing to be here." Dr. Vaughn said, "She has no legal standing. She also has no agenda. I cannot say the same for everyone in this hallway." Reginald Crenshaw materialized from behind them with his leather folder. He opened it and produced a document formal with the header of a law firm in Buckhead. He offered it to Dr. Vaughn. It was a written request submitted on behalf of Jalen and Destiny Ashford for the formal removal of Camilla Sable from the patient visitation list, citing concerns about undue influence in a medically vulnerable individual. Dr. Vaughn took it. She read it. She set it on the counter of the nurse's station. "File it with the court," she said. "I will testify on Miss Sable's behalf. You will lose." Crenshaw said nothing. He had been a lawyer long enough to recognize a sentence that could not be answered without making things worse. Camilla stood where she was. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She held the empty container and the folding chair, and she stood in the hallway with her back straight and her face calm, and she waited for the moment to pass. She had been told she did not belong in places before. She had learned a long time ago that the most effective answer was to keep standing where she was, not combatively, not with defiance, simply as a fact. Jalen and Destiny went into Terrell's room. They stayed for 22 minutes. When they came out, neither of them looked at Camilla. They walked to the elevator. The doors opened. They stepped inside. The doors closed. The following week, the memories began to return. Week 5 after the accident, Terrell woke one morning and said to Camilla, "My name is Terrell." She said yes. He said it again slowly, the way a person says a word in a foreign language they are just beginning to learn, carefully testing whether it fits in their mouth. Terrell Ashford. He looked at his hands. "I have always folded things." "Yes," she said. Week 6, he said, "There was a town, smaller than this, a factory. My father worked there." He paused. "I remember the sound of the door when he came home. I don't remember his face yet, but I remember the sound of the door, the particular sound of that door in that house. I could not describe it, but I could hear it." Week 7, he looked up from the window and said, $3,800, that was the first one, a duplex, I fixed it myself. He was quiet. "The floor in the kitchen was so rotten I fell through it on the second day." He paused. A sound came from him that was not quite a laugh, but was related to the sound of a man recognizing a younger version of himself and finding that recognition unexpectedly tender. "I was standing in the hole up to my waist, and I thought, what else is there to do but laugh?" He looked at his hands. "I remember the laughing. I remember it very clearly." Week 7 also brought something else. Camilla had been sitting with him for 20 minutes, both of them quiet in the way they had learned to be quiet together, when Terrell said, "Tell me about the kitchen again, the 2 in the morning kitchen." She said, "What do you want to know?" He said, "I want to know what happened before you came downstairs." Camilla folded her hands. She said, "I don't know what happened before. I know what I found." He nodded. He looked at the window. "I think I do," he said slowly. "I think I had been holding something for a very long time, and one night it stopped being holdable." He paused. "I remember looking at my hands at the table. I remember they were flat on the surface. I remember thinking about a ring." He looked at his own hands now. "I wore a ring for 22 years, and I remember looking at it that night the way you look at something that no longer belongs to you. Not with anger, just with the understanding that it is finished." Camilla said nothing. She let him find the shape of it on his own. He said, "I wasn't sad about the divorce. I was sad about the 22 years inside it." He looked at her. "That's what the crying was. Not a response to something ending. A response to something I had been pretending wasn't true for longer than I could name." She said yes. He said, "You stayed." She said, "You needed someone to stay." He was quiet. Then he said, "No one stays at 2 in the morning for the help." Camilla looked at him steadily. "You were not the help. You were a person in a kitchen who needed someone to sit with him. I was a person in a kitchen who knew how to sit." He looked at his hands for a long moment after that, the fingers still, the familiar rectangles of folded paper on the table beside him. He said, "After that night, you started receiving extra money in your pay, $200, every month for 8 months. Camilla looked at him. She said, "Yes." He said, "You never said anything." She said, "Neither did you." He nodded slowly. "That was the only language available to me at the time," he said. "I should have found a better one." Week 8, he woke up and he knew their faces. Jalen standing slightly left of center, in a doorway the way he had since he was 14. Destiny holding her phone in her right hand, always close to her body, as if it contained something she was protecting. He knew them. And knowing them confirmed rather than replaced what he had felt when he did not know them. The feeling had been accurate. The names had simply been missing. On a Monday morning in week 9, Cheryl came to find Camilla and Aisha before she went into the room. She said his children filed a motion with the Fulton County Probate Court this morning. Emergency guardianship. They're asking a judge to appoint Jalen as legal guardian and to restrict non-family visitation. Camilla stood in the hallway. "Dr. Vaughn has already been contacted," Cheryl said. "She's going to oppose it." She paused. "I thought you should know." Camilla thanked her. She went into the room. Terrell was sitting in the chair by the window. He had a folded piece of paper in his hands. When she sat down, he looked at her and said, "I want my things, the bag from the car. Is it still here?" She pressed the call button. Cheryl came. Cheryl brought the labeled plastic bag from the closet. Terrell opened it. The wallet with the folded bills, the phone with the cracked screen, the keys, and a single piece of paper from the inside pocket of his jacket, handwritten, folded twice. He unfolded it, he read it again. His face did not change dramatically. It changed the way a room changes when a window is opened, something small and irreversible, shifting in the quality of the air. He looked at the paper for a longer time. He looked at the window. The light had reached the middle of the floor and was moving toward the far wall. He held the paper out to Camilla. She took it. She read it. She read her own name in his handwriting. The list said call Jalen birthday next week, then Camilla Sable check address, then foundation housing for healthcare workers. She was very still. He said, I was looking for you before the crash. I had asked my assistant to find your address. I was going to reach out. Camilla held the paper. She read her name again, written in the same hand that had folded bills into rectangles for 45 years. He said, I was coming back to you. I just didn't get there in time. She folded the paper carefully with precision and attention, the way she folded everything. She placed it in the pocket of her coat. She said, you got there. 6 years before the accident, at 2 o'clock in the morning, the kitchen in the house in Buckhead was dark, except for the small light above the stove, which cast a warm circle on the counter and left the rest of the room in the kind of darkness that makes a large space feel intimate, that reduces a house to the size of its smallest comfort. Terrell had been sitting at the table since midnight. His hands were flat on the surface. He was not crying yet. He was in the stage that comes before crying when the body has arrived at the edge of something and is still deciding whether to go over. Nyan had asked for the divorce that morning. She had been calm about it. That was the thing he could not stop turning over the calm. She had asked for it the way you ask for a window to be opened, as if the air had gotten stale, and the solution was obvious, and the only question was whether the other person would cooperate. He had nodded. He had gone to work. He had run a meeting about the Midtown project and signed documents and driven home and eaten dinner alone because she had already moved to the guest room efficiently without announcement, as if the geography of their separation had been worked out in advance. And then at midnight, sitting in the kitchen with the stove light on, he had begun to understand something. He was not devastated. He had expected to be devastated. He had expected that the end of a 22-year marriage would arrive with the force of something structural giving way, the way a building fails suddenly and completely after years of invisible stress. But it had not felt like that. It had felt like the removal of a weight he had been carrying for so long that he had stopped noticing it was a weight and had simply incorporated it into his posture, into the way he moved through the world. Until the day it was taken away, and he discovered that what he had been calling stability was actually the labor of holding something up. The absence of devastation was the most devastating thing of all, because it told him something about the 22 years that he did not want to know, that he had been alone inside his marriage for longer than he could name, that the loneliness he had attributed to the nature of ambition, to the price of building, to the necessary cost of what he was doing, had not been the price of ambition. It had been the shape of a life that had stopped being inhabited from the inside. Camilla had come downstairs for water. She had seen him at the table in the dark and the stove light and had understood without needing to be told what kind of moment she had walked into. She had not retreated. She had not announced herself. She had simply walked to the cabinet and taken out a glass and filled it with water and set it in front of him on the table, and then she had pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. She had not looked at him. She had looked at the stove light. She had folded her hands in her lap, and she had been quiet in the way that she was always quiet in his kitchen. Not the quiet of someone waiting for the conversation to start, but the quiet of someone who understood that the conversation was already happening. He had cried. Not loudly, not the way grief arrives in the first moments after a loss sharp and sudden, the way it arrives after a long journey quietly without drama, with the particular exhaustion of a person who has finally stopped moving. She had stayed for 45 minutes. Neither of them had spoken. At some point, the crying stopped. At some point, the water was drunk. At some point, the kitchen was just a kitchen again. Then Camilla stood up. She took the glass. She washed it. She dried it. She placed it back in the cabinet. She said, "Good night, Mr. Ashford." She went upstairs. The next morning, neither of them mentioned it. But something had happened in that kitchen that could not be unhappened. Not between them exactly, because nothing had been said and nothing had been offered and nothing had been asked for. But in him, a man who had spent 45 years knowing exactly what was in his pockets at all times, had discovered in a dark kitchen at 2 in the morning that he had been carrying something he had never counted, something that did not show up in any inventory. that could not be folded into a small, neat rectangle and placed facing the right direction. The knowledge that someone had stayed, that someone had sat across from him while he came apart and had not needed him to put himself back together before she left. That was the thing his brain had kept closer than everything else. Closer than his name, closer than his company, closer than his children's faces. The knowledge that once at 2 in the morning, he had not been alone. Rosalind Dwyer had worked for Terrell Ashford for 16 years. She had a desk outside his office at Ashford Development Group's Midtown headquarters and a reputation for knowing at any given moment where every document, every scheduled meeting, and every significant decision currently stood. She was the person who knew which calls Terrell returned first and which ones he let sit, which vendors he trusted on instinct, and which ones he watched with patience before deciding. She had been the institutional memory of his professional life in the way that Kamaya's leather notebook had been the institutional memory of his personal one, two women in two different worlds, keeping account of a man who did not know they were doing it. She had been the one, 3 weeks before the accident, who had made the phone call to a private researcher and asked for a residential address. Marcus found her number through the hospital's visitor contact log, which listed Rosalind as one of the few people Terrell had asked to be informed of his condition. He called her from the parking lot of Grady Memorial on the morning after his mother received the piece of paper. Rosalind answered on the third ring. Marcus said, "Ms. Dwyer, my name is Marcus Sable. My mother is Kamaya Sable. She used to work for Mr. Ashford." A pause. Then Rosalind said, "I know who your mother is." Marcus said Mr. Ashford had a list in his jacket pocket when the accident happened. My mother's name was on it. He said he had asked someone to find her address. Rosalind's was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That was me. He came to my desk on a Tuesday afternoon about 3 weeks before the crash. He didn't explain why. He said he'd been thinking about some people he had lost track of, and he wanted to reach back out. He gave me 4 names. Your mother was one of them." Marcus said, "Did he say anything else about her specifically?" "He said, and I remember this exactly because it was not the way he usually spoke, he said she did something for me once that I never properly acknowledged, and I've been carrying that for too long." Marcus stood in the parking lot with the phone pressed to his ear. The morning traffic on the street behind him was building toward rush hour. He thought about his mother sitting in a break room at a Marriott reading a 3-paragraph article about a man she had not seen in 6 years and deciding without hesitation to go. "I found the address," Rosalind said. "I put it on his desk the Wednesday before the accident. He told me he'd handle it himself." She paused. The accident was the following Wednesday. Marcus said, "Thank you." He ended the call. He stood for a moment in the November light, which was the particular light of Atlanta in late autumn, pale and honest and without the softening that summer haze provides. He thought about the Wednesday between those 2 Wednesdays. The one where Terrell Ashford had gone to work and sat in a building with his name on it and driven home at night and been 3 hours from a phone call that would have changed everything and had not made it. He went inside. He went upstairs. He knocked on the door of room 412. Terrell was in the chair by the window. He was alone. Camilla had stepped out to speak with Dr. Vaughn. Marcus came in. He stood near the door. He was 29 years old, broad-shouldered, with a stillness about him that he had inherited from his mother and was only now beginning to understand as a form of strength rather than restraint. He had spent the past 9 days in Atlanta watching a man recover himself from nothing, watching familiar objects and familiar routines and the familiar presence of a woman who had once brought him scrambled eggs become the material from which a person was reassembled. He had watched this and he had thought about what it meant. Terrell looked at him. Marcus said, "You don't know me." Terrell said, "You have your mother's eyes." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He said, "I told her not to come. When she first found out about the accident, I told her you wouldn't remember her, that it was one-sided, that she was walking into something that could hurt her." Terrell looked at the window. He said, "Were you wrong?" Marcus said, "About the risk, no. About her, yes." He looked at Terrell directly. "She did the same thing for my father. Sat in a hospital chair for 14 months. Not because she owed him something, because that's who she is." He paused. "I needed to see you to understand that what she was doing here wasn't about what she would get from it. It was about who she would be if she didn't come." Terrell was quiet. The light from the window lay across the floor in a long, pale rectangle. He said, Do you know what the first memory was when everything came back? Marcus shook his head. Not the company, not my children, not the buildings. The first thing was a kitchen at 2 in the morning, a small light above the stove. Your mother sitting across a table from me, not saying a word while I came apart at the seams. He looked at Marcus. A man can build $6 billion worth of things and still not know how to sit in a room where someone else needs company. Your mother knew. She knew without being asked and without needing to be thanked. That is not a small thing. He paused. You were right to be protective. She is worth protecting. Marcus stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he nodded once and said, take care of her. Terrell said, I intend to. The motion for emergency guardianship was scheduled for a hearing before a Fulton County probate judge on a Thursday morning. Dr. Vaughn submitted a 14-page opposition letter. She attached Terrell's cognitive assessment scores, his verbal output logs, his physiological response data from the monitoring equipment, and a formal clinical statement concluding that Terrell Ashford retained full decision-making capacity and did not meet any statutory criteria for guardianship under Georgia law. She also included a supplemental note, handwritten at the bottom of the final page. It said, in 23 years of neurology practice, I have not encountered a case of retrograde amnesia recovery that proceeded as rapidly or as completely without the presence of a consistent, emotionally engaged person from the patient's pre-injury life. Miss Sable's visits did not interfere with this patient's care. They were by every clinical measure I can apply the primary mechanism of it. The hearing lasted 40 minutes. The judge reviewed Dr. Vaughn's submission, asked 3 questions of the petitioner's attorney, and denied the motion. He noted for the record that the clinical evidence did not support the statutory threshold for incapacity and that the petitioners had not demonstrated that the patient's care was being compromised by the visitor in question. Jalen and Destiny sat in the courtroom as the decision was read. Crenshaw wrote something in his leather folder. When they stood to leave, Jalen looked older than he had looked when he first arrived at Grady Memorial. Not older in years, older in the way that happens when a decision you made with certainty has been ruled against, and you are left standing in the room where it happened. And all the arguments that seemed ironclad when you assembled them have been found insufficient by a person with no stake in either outcome. They came to the hospital that afternoon, not with lawyers, not with folders. They came alone the way people come when there is nothing left to protect themselves with. Terrell was in the chair by the window when they knocked and entered. Camilla was seated beside him. She stood when they came in, started to pick up her chair. Terrell said, please stay. She sat back down. Jalen stood at the foot of the bed. He was quiet for a long time. The monitors kept their rhythm. The light came in from the window. Then he said, I know what I did. Terrell looked at his son, the face he had remembered first not as an image, but as a posture standing slightly left of center, in a doorway, the way he had since he was 14 years old. A habit picked up from standing outside a father's home office, waiting to be noticed, to be called in, to be acknowledged by a man who expressed himself through achievement rather than presence. Terrell said, come here. Jalen came to the side of the bed. Terrell said, I have spent 45 years building things, towers, complexes, things that could be seen from the highway. I thought if I built enough of them, the life I had made would speak for itself. I did not understand that the people in my life needed to hear it from me, not from a building. He looked at his son. I failed you in that, long before any of this. Jalen pressed his lips together. He looked at the window. He said, I learned to measure everything the way you measure property. Square footage, market value, return on investment. He paused. When you were lying in this room without a name, my first instinct was to measure what that meant for the holdings. I am not going to pretend that isn't true. And I am not going to pretend I didn't know when I was doing it that something was wrong with the calculation. I know, Terrell said. I don't know how to stop doing it. You start by knowing you're doing it, Terrell said. That's the first thing. The rest is time. He looked at his son steadily. And it is time I owe you. I kept you at a distance and called it opportunity, and I have been wrong about that for a long time. Destiny had been standing near the door. She came forward now. She sat in the chair on the other side of the bed, and she looked at her father with the expression of someone who has been carrying something for a longer time and has run out of the strength to carry it differently. She said, when you didn't remember us, it was the worst thing I had ever felt, but then I started to realize something. You didn't remember us, but you remembered her. She glanced at Camilla briefly, then back at her father. And I thought, what does that mean about us? What did we do or not do that made a former employee the first person your brain called back? She was quiet for a moment. The room was very still. I've been asking myself that question for weeks. I don't like the answer I keep arriving at. Terrell said, the brain goes first toward the things that were safest, the ones that asked the least and gave the most. He paused. That is not your fault entirely. I made the conditions for it. I gave you everything except the parts of me that were worth knowing. I gave you positions, and I did not give you a father who sat down and told you what he was afraid of, and what he was proud of, and what he had gotten wrong. He looked at both of them. That begins now, if you want it. The room was quiet for a while. The light had moved past the middle of the floor and was climbing the far wall. Camilla sat in her chair with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the window, giving the three of them the privacy of her stillness. She had given Terrell privacy in a kitchen 6 years ago by being present without demanding acknowledgement, by understanding that sometimes the most useful thing a person can do in a room is simply not require anything of it. When Jalen and Destiny left an hour later, they passed Camilla at the door. Jalen stopped. He looked at her. He said, "Thank you." Just that. 2 words, but they carried more than the words themselves. She nodded. Destiny said nothing. She looked at the floor for a moment, then at Camilla. Something crossed her face that was not composure. That was the thing underneath the composure that composure had been covering for a long time. Then she walked to the elevator. The next morning, Terrell asked to be connected to the Ashford Development Group board meeting by video call. Rosalind arranged it from his hospital room. A laptop was brought in, set on the bedside table, angled toward the chair by the window, where Terrell sat in his hospital robe with the IV pole beside him and the morning light across his shoulders. Camilla sat in her folding chair just out of the frame, present, but not visible, which was the way she had been present in his life for 9 years. The board members were in the conference room on the 14th floor of the Midtown Tower, the one with his name on the building in letters that could be read from the interstate. There were 9 of them. They saw him on the screen. Several of them had not seen him in 11 weeks. Based on the reports reaching them through Jalen and through Crenshaw's legal maneuvering, most of them had been operating under the assumption that they were navigating the beginning of a leadership transition, that the man who had built this company was receding, and that the company was about to enter a new chapter that would be written by someone else. What they saw instead was a man sitting in a hospital chair, with his hands resting on his knees, and his face carrying the particular calm of someone who has been through something that most people cannot imagine, and has come out of it knowing things he did not know before. For a moment, no one spoke. The room in Midtown was quiet. The room in Grady Memorial was quiet. Then Terrell said, "I have been absent for 11 weeks. I am aware of the interim decisions that have been made and the ones that are pending. I want the board to know that my cognitive function has been assessed and cleared by my attending neurologist, documentation of which Rosalind will distribute after this call." He paused. He looked at the screen at the 9 faces assembled in the room he had built with decisions made over decades. Most of them good, some of them wrong, and all of them his. "I also want to say something that is not in any report." He leaned forward slightly. "I spent 17 days in this room before anyone who knew me came through the door. 17 days without a name, without a history, without a single face I recognized. And what I learned in those 17 days is something I could not have learned in 45 years of building things." He stopped. He looked at his hands. "I learned that the thing a person is, what they actually are beneath the company and the net worth and the name on the building, is held not in their own memory, but in the memories of the people who stayed close enough to remember it for them." He raised his eyes back to the screen. "I am coming back, not because the company needs me, though I believe it does, because I have work left to do and I am not finished." A board member named Gerald Whitfield, who had been with Ashford Development Group for 12 years and had voted against 3 of Terrell's largest acquisitions and been proven wrong on each one, said quietly, "Good." Just that word, but the way he said it changed the temperature of the room. A second member, Harriet Ewan, the audit committee chair, who had spent the past 11 weeks preparing for a scenario in which the chair did not come back, said, "We are glad you're coming back, Terrell. This company has not been itself without you." The honesty of it landed in the room with the weight of something that had been held back until it was safe to say. The other 7 board members said nothing. They did not need to. The decision had already been made in the way decisions are made before the vote, in the posture of the room, in the absence of the objection that would have been raised if it was coming. Terrell said, "I'll need 2 weeks to wrap up what's happening here. Then I'll be back in the building." He looked toward Rosalind, off to the side where she had positioned herself. Rosalind knows what needs to happen in the meantime. Rosalind, who had been with him for 16 years and had seen him navigate contracts and crises and the particular loneliness of a man at the top of a very tall building, looked at the screen and said, "Yes, sir." The call ended. Rosalind closed the laptop. She stood for a moment in the room holding the computer against her chest, and she looked at him. She said, "That's the first time in 11 years I've seen you use the story about the floor in a board context." Terrell said, "I used to think the story was embarrassing. I thought I had to grow past it." He looked at his hands. "I was wrong about that too. The floor is the whole story. Everything else is what came after the floor." Terrell was discharged 11 weeks and 3 days after the accident. Dr. Vaughn signed the papers on a Thursday morning. She told him that his memory had recovered to approximately 85%. Some gaps would remain, a name here, a date there, rooms he had been in that he would never fully see again. She said, "That is normal. Brains are not filing cabinets. They are rivers. Some water returns to the same path. Some finds a new one. What matters is that the river is still moving." He thanked her. She said, "Don't thank me. Thank the woman with the eggs." He met with Jalen first. The conversation took place in Terrell's office at Ashford Development Group, the first time he had been in the building since the crash. He sat behind the desk. Jalen sat across from it. The desk between them felt different from how it had felt before the accident, less like a surface for transactions and more like an obstacle both of them were trying to see around. 2 hours, difficult, honest. It did not resolve everything, but it began. He told Jalen, "I gave you everything I never had. I did not give you the thing that made everything possible, which was the experience of having nothing. That was my mistake. I am correcting it." Jalen said, "That's going to be hard." Terrell said, "Yes, it is. Most things worth doing are." He paused. "I also want you to know that the hard part is the opportunity. That is what I missed when I tried to give you the outcome without the process. The process is where you become the person who can sustain the outcome." He met with Destiny the following week. 90 minutes. Also difficult, also honest, also a beginning. She asked him if he would ever trust her the way he had before. He said he had not trusted her the way she needed to be trusted before. He had given her a position instead of a challenge. That was not trust. It was convenience dressed up as opportunity. She sat with that for a long time. Then she said, "I want to earn it." He said, "Then start tomorrow." He restructured the company. Jalen and Destiny were removed from the positions that had been created for them. They could return, but they would have to start where everyone who earns something has to start, from the ground. He did not do it to punish them. He did it for the same reason he had once laughed in a hole in a kitchen floor in Monroe, Georgia. Because the ground is where the learning happens, and the learning is the whole point. Rosalind came to see him the week after he returned to the office. She brought the file she had been keeping since the accident, every board communication, every interim decision, every memo that had crossed her desk in 11 weeks. She set it on the table. She said, "You'll want to know what was decided and what was discussed and what was decided against." He looked at the file. He said, "Is there anything in there that can't be fixed?" She said, "No." He said, "Then leave it with me and I'll get through it." She started toward the door. He said, "Rosalind." She stopped. He said, "I put the list to there because I knew I had been avoiding some things that mattered. Camilla's name was on it because I had carried that kitchen for 6 years and I had never said anything to her, and I was tired of carrying it without doing something about it." He paused. "I want you to know that you were also on the list." Rosalind stood at the door for a moment. Then she said, "I know, Mr. Ashford, you told me when you gave it to me." He said, "I know, I just wanted to say it again in a way that was about you and not about the task." She left. He opened the file. The building outside the window was full of people doing work that he understood and had built the conditions for. The city beyond it was full of buildings he had put there, structures he had willed into existence through patience and borrowed money and the particular stubbornness of a man who had once stood in a hole and laughed. He looked at the file and then he looked at the window and he understood something that 11 weeks in a hospital room had arranged for him to understand. The towers were not what he had built. The towers were evidence of what he had built. What he had actually built was a way of seeing a way of walking into a space that was failing and identifying the precise point of failure and understanding how to address it without destroying what remained sound. He had applied it to buildings for 45 years. He had only recently begun to apply it to the other structures in his life. He picked up the file. He began to read. Several weeks after the restructuring, Jalen called Terrell on a Sunday morning. He was calling from the office. He had been there since 7. He said, "I'm looking at the Crestwood project and I think there's something wrong with the site analysis. The drainage projections don't account for the grade change on the east side." He described what he had found. He described it carefully and with the kind of precision that comes not from training, but from having looked at the problem long enough to actually understand it. Terrell listened. When Jalen finished, Terrell said, "You're right. The east grade is the problem. How would you fix it?" Jalen was quiet for a moment. Then he began to talk, and Terrell listened. And for the first time in 38 years of fatherhood, the conversation between them was not about what had been given or what had been withheld. It was about the work. It was two people looking at the same problem and neither of them needing the other one to be someone they were not. When the call ended, Terrell sat for a moment with the phone in his hand. His fingers out of habit began to fold the edge of a piece of paper on his desk into a small, neat rectangle. He let them. He thought about the Sunday morning call and what it meant that Jalen had been in the office at 7 and had found the problem himself and had called not to report it, but to think through it out loud. He thought about what it costs a person to start again from the beginning when they have already had everything and what it means to choose to do it anyway, and whether that choice made freely was worth more than any position he could have simply handed over. He thought it was. 6 weeks after discharge on a Saturday morning, Marcus drove Camilla to the west side of Atlanta. He waited in the car. Camilla went up the one flight of stairs and waited. Terrell arrived at 8:43. He had driven himself. He parked on the street and sat for a moment before getting out of the car, looking at the building the way he had once looked at buildings he was about to go into, and change assessing it not for its market value, but for what it was: a place where someone lived, a place that had been made orderly and dignified by someone who believed that dignity lived in the details even when nobody was watching. He knocked. Camilla opened the door in a clean blouse and the comfortable shoes she always wore. The apartment behind her was small and orderly. One bedroom, a window that caught the morning light, a kitchen with a table and 2 chairs that had never both been occupied at the same time until now. He stepped inside. He looked at the kitchen. He looked at the window and the light coming through it falling across the table in a warm shape that his body knew before his mind had words for it. He sat down. Camilla went to the stove. Scrambled eggs, no salt. Toast cut on the diagonal. Coffee black poured from the same thermos into the white ceramic mug, plain and heavy and without pattern. She set everything on the table. She sat across from him. They did not speak. For 20 minutes they sat in the quiet of that kitchen the way they had always been quiet in his kitchen before either of them knew the silence would come to matter this much. The light moved across the table. The coffee cooled. The eggs were good. When the 20 minutes had passed, Terrell said, "I want to build something for the people who do what you do." Camilla said, "What do I do?" Terrell looked at her. He said, "You show up every day. You do the work nobody sees. And when someone breaks, you sit with them at 2 in the morning and you don't leave." He said, "I want to build something for those people. Healthcare, housing, the things that the people who take care of everyone else never have enough of for themselves. The people who make other people's houses run and never have enough left to make their own run well." Camille looked at her hands on the table. She said, "That is a lot." He said, "It is not enough, but it is a start." He told her the name, the Sable Foundation. She looked at him. She said, "You don't have to name it after me." He said, "I want the name of someone who showed up. That is the whole point of it, not someone who built towers, someone who came through a door with a folding chair and eggs and stayed until the person inside the room was ready to come back. That is the thing this foundation is about. I want its name to say so." She was quiet for a long time after that. She looked at the mug on the table between them. She looked at the rectangle of light from the window. She thought about Jerome, who had been a quiet man, a careful man, A man who had worked at the water treatment plant for 31 years and had never been celebrated for it and had never expected to be. A man who had known how to be present in a room the way a good structural element knows how to be present in a building not noticed until it is gone, and then catastrophically missed. She thought about what it would have meant to him if someone had seen the work he did and named something after it. Not the labor of it, the quality of the person who showed up and did it. Tyrrell watched her think. He did not interrupt. He had learned in 9 years of mornings and 11 weeks of recovery that Kamaya's silences were not empty. They were the spaces in which she arrived at things. The most important things she had ever said to him had come out of silences that he had been tempted to fill and had eventually learned to leave alone. She was quiet. She looked at the window. The light had moved past the table and was reaching the counter. The kitchen felt the way he had once said a kitchen should feel, not like a hospital, like a kitchen. She said Jerome would have liked that. It was the first time she had said her husband's name to Tyrrell in all the years she had known him. It sat in the room gently without needing to be examined the way good things sit in rooms when there is space for them. A man who had slept in this apartment and eaten at this table and been loved by the woman sitting across it. A man whose last months had been accompanied by someone who knew how to sit in a room and stay, who had learned it so thoroughly that it had become the thing she gave to every room she entered. Tyrrell reached it into his pocket. He took out a small piece of paper. He folded it slowly, deliberately into a small, neat rectangle, the way his hands had always folded things, the habit that had survived everything the accident had taken, that had been one of the first things Camilla noticed when she sat in this room with him all those weeks ago and watched his hands find their way back to what they knew. He placed it on the table between them. Camilla looked at it. She reached into the pocket of her coat. She took out the other piece of paper, the one with her name on it in his handwriting, the one from the plastic bag in the hospital closet, the one that had been in his jacket pocket on the night a car crossed a median on E85 and everything stopped. She had folded it carefully the day he gave it to her. She placed it on the table beside his. Two folded pieces of paper, side by side on the kitchen table. Neither of them spoke. Outside the window, Atlanta moved through its Saturday morning cars and buses and people with places to be the ordinary machinery of a city doing its ordinary work. Inside the kitchen, the light was everywhere. The eggs were finished. The coffee was cold. He had spent 45 years building things that could be seen from the highway. 14 towers, 3 complexes, a name in letters large enough to read at 60 miles an hour. This was the first thing he had built that fit on a kitchen table. Marcus was still in the car on the street below. He had been watching the time. At 9:15, he saw that the light in the kitchen window was still on. He leaned back in the seat. He turned the radio on low. The song that came through was old gospel, the kind his mother had played on Saturday mornings in a house on the other side of the city, the kind that was not about arrival, but about the willingness to keep moving towards something you could not yet see. He let it play. He waited. The way his mother had always waited, without hurry, without condition, present in the way that presence had always been the thing she knew how to give for as long as it needed to take.